some of the questions that you have about the first project. Yeah, so I just want to say keep calm and love APIs. I hope that, this project's almost getting to the end of it. And I think we've learned a lot. And hopefully we will sort out everything that we need to sort out. Okay, so just one thing before we continue, just somebody mentioned to me, which was very helpful, that there are many people who are struggling with logging in. And one of the problems is, last year we used this Microsoft account and they removed it from the NWU, from the university. So unfortunately, that was still in our documentation, but you cannot use that account because you are locked out of it. So what you apparently can do if you have that problem is you can just remove it from Visual Studio. If you look at your account in Visual Studio, remove it there and then try again. Second point is there are some people whose credits have run out on their subscription, their student subscription. Now, there's really nothing we can do there. I'm very sorry about that, but we've spoken to Microsoft before. Sorry, I just want to go back. We've spoken to Microsoft before. And, there's nothing that it's been linked to your account, and there's nothing really we can do about that. So unfortunately, what you have to do is you have to now go and create a new subscription for yourself. And on the subscription, you need to put in a credit card. Now, the first month, you get everything for free. But after that, you'll have to start monitoring what is going on. But, what we are using mainly is a lot of free services, and it should not, if it's going to cost you something, if you manage it well, it shouldn't cost anything. But that's why last week when you do the demo, we really told you to be very careful how you actually set up your databases and so on. So it's unfortunately something we cannot do much about. It's not in our control. Okay, then the next point is, I'm going to look at it just now, but the rubric has been updated. So what we've removed from the rubric is we've removed the API management service that we wanted you to do. It was just there for a bonus mark, but we've decided to remove it because it is something that does cost a lot of money. And we just want to be careful about this, but I'm going to show you how it works. And so, we want to make sure that you keep track of your costing. Okay, now, we are busy marking project one. So for project one, and this was also unfortunately a confusion that we had, and it was sort of my fault. But project one, the Kanban project must be public. Okay, so you must, for us to be able to market, your Kanban project is public and your repos are private. That's where you store your code. And that will be the case from now on. And it's very important, we've been struggling to mark projects because of the access. We can't get to your, repos and Kanban project. But, for project two, be very careful that you do give us the access we need, the collaborators. And if you see, we are, there are like hundreds of you. So, I have to accept all these requests, and it could be that I miss someone. You don't see your emails, get bogged with all this stuff. So if you see that I haven't accepted, or any of the others haven't accepted your request, just go and resend it. Just check on your project. It hasn't been accepted. Resend the invitation if your invitation has expired. And by that, if we all work together, we can make sure that we try to accommodate, more of what is going on. Okay, so let me just see if there are any other questions here that I can quickly look at. Okay, so let's just have a look here. Okay, where's the chat? Okay, so you can use those ones. We'll talk about what we are going to be doing in project two in terms of the controllers and so forth. And then the other one is that, no, we should not be using the MS Fed. It must be your student account. So your proper student account that you normally have. Okay, and we'll talk about the credits and so on that we are going to be looking at. Okay, right, so for our purposes, I'm just going to quickly show you, we've left out the API management service that we actually wanted you to add. But this is basically what it looks like. And it's a very important component in Azure, and all these cloud platforms, they all have the same thing. And it's something that helps us a lot to, manage our API. So if you should just publish your API and not really ever have the ability to handle what's ever going on in the background properly, then it's not something that, is going to be so sophisticated and perhaps secure and manageable. So if you look at the API management component, you'll see that here it consists out of two things. It's got the API gateway, and it's got here a developer portal. And so the developer portal is where we can actually sit and see and configure what we need to see. And the gateway then, whenever calls are made from the outside, the gateway has the option of, let's say, doing some security, setting up those calls types of rules, whatever it is that you want to do. And you can do some debugging on it, so there's a lot of options available for us to be able to actually handle our APIs better using the API gateway. But yeah, unfortunately, it is costly. So that's why we removed it. But if you would like to go sort of, look at it and enable it, I'm going to show you what to do. Yeah, and so when, for example, we are, so this is just a gateway that actually picks up your requests, and it will, look at what is the URI that you are accessing, the URL, and it may also redirect things, so you may think this is an address that's going in here, but it may actually redirect it somewhere else. So, there's a lot of options available here for our API management that we can do. So let's have a look. So what I would like to show you is in Azure. So I'm just going to quickly show you, in Azure how we do it. So I've created here for my web application 16, I've created an API management. It's extended with API M. And so what happens basically is I come with this screen, and then here I have the option of actually enabling my APIs. What you do is, if you want to define a new one, so what you have to do is you have to pull in your documentation of your API. You have to pull it in here. So where is your documentation? So your documentation of your API is sitting, you can, for example, go and you can look at when you are hosting your actual, Azure site. So what you do is you append it here and you say Swagger version 1 Swagger.json. And that's something else I can just quickly mention. If you want to run your, just go there. If you want to run your API on the cloud using Swagger, you'll have to go and append. This is the code. When you are going to actually be adding Swagger in here, this is what you're going to be adding in. So what I'm saying here is I'm going to change when I'm using Swagger. I'm going to say, right, what is my Swagger endpoint? It is Swagger version 1 Swagger.json. So that is something you can add this into your code. This is something that you have to do if you want to enable access via Swagger of your API on Azure. So that's what so this is why this is the address that I'm using. So here I'm looking at my address, and so what do I see here? This is the Open API specification. I'm looking at my project, and here I see, okay, I have a get, and basically what it's doing here, it's actually describing my API in terms of all the methods. So what I now do is I'm going to say, okay, well, my API management service doesn't really know anything about what's going on. So I'm going to add it in here. And basically what you do here is you're now going to take that URL that you see there, and you're going to be adding it in here. I've already done it. You're going to create it. And then you're going to say, well, I now have my API in here. I've already done it. So now what I can do is I'm going to now be able to here look at like here I have my get. So I can now see, okay, this is where I can test my get. I can then say, well, here is a test option. So I go here to my test option, and here I can go and say I can send a request to get something. So it's going to now access, it's basically the get command that I would be doing from the outside, from a client side. It's now doing it internally here, and I can now be testing. So you can see here, so I've now created the get command. I've said 200 OK, and you can see I've got 3 customers on my thing. There are some settings we can set up here. And so, this is where you can basically go, and you can now go and see how you can, I know one of the options we have to do is uncheck that option there. You shouldn't require that. And you can also here update this web service URL to that. Yeah, so, okay, let me just see, is people saying they can't see my screen? Okay, so can you all see my screen? Okay, thank you. I think you probably, if you don't see my screen, then it's just a connection issue from your side. Okay, so basically, this is what we do on the API management service. So what we see here is I can now be testing all my different methods here. I can be looking at how they work. If you've got issues, you can come here and sort it out. And here on the side, you can see there's a lot of things that we can now configure. You've got authorizations, you've got identities, you can go here, you can look at an analytics and so on. So the API management gateway, or the option here, is very useful for us to actually be debugging our applications. And you can go and try this out, when you are busy. So what I would also like to show you now is costing. So I have here costing that has been running up. And this is the problem that we have. So I've only really enabled my API manager. You can see this is now what I'm looking at here. I've enabled it on Tuesday. So it's now 2 days later, so just wait for it to load. And so you can see this is what's going on here. So what I can see here is my API management sort of component is now running at almost $3. So, if I do this in 2 days, you'll imagine that in a few weeks from today, if I've got this enabled, my $100 are going to be gone. And so my SQL database is not really consuming that much. And, so I've set for myself a budget of $10 so that when $10 is reached, I will get a notification. So I've only really enabled this for you to see what's happening. So if you want to enable the API management option and then have a look at it and test your little application, make sure everything works well, you know now what to do, and you can go in here into this part, and you can then just set up your costing, that you understand the costing. But the main problem that we have is actually the API management is going to be more expensive, and that is why we removed it from the rubric. So let me just quickly look at the rubric. So here is the rubric for project 2 that's now updated. It's on eFundi. I updated it this morning. So go and have a look at the one this morning to see what it's all about. So basically, first of all, we have a data access layer for 15%. And you can see the maximum mark you'll get here is 3.75. And so what we want you to do is scaffolding our 3 tables, and then connecting to the database on Azure. So it's very important that you actually have it on Azure. And then we have our business logic, where we are going to be writing our methods, and all the information is there, how you should do it. Okay, then security. Okay, so basically for security, you have to enable the authentication that I'm going to do today. And you can see that, it's sort of a bonus mark, and it's authentication on all your endpoints. So that's what we would like to see, that you've secured all your endpoints. Hosting, but this is very important. You can now see hosting here. No cloud hosted version of API results in minus 30%. So, if you can't, this is the most important thing to start and get right, is that you actually have your hosting right, and that your API is sitting on the cloud. The security, if you don't get to the security, don't stress about that. Do that later. Make sure that you have a API on the cloud. Then Scrum. So what do we want here? We want you to actually go and update your GitHub on, project 2. And you've got your repo there. You want to look at your hours again. How do you spend it? what are your tasks? Are they detailed tasks and so on? So we want to make sure that you're looking at Scrum source control, and very important here is source control. Have you added your project there? So in other words, repo 2. Are you using version control? And then very important, are you committing? So, 7 days, you should start committing to your repo 2 already from today or before. Otherwise, you won't get that mark. README file to say how your API will be used by other people, how would they enable it, and then how do you ensure that there are no credentials about, so you just write something about that, how are you going to do that? Then your training and then your references. So all of this together is then what we expect of you in project 2. Right, so that is all I have there. So let me just go and see if there are any questions. Okay, so, okay. Yeah, so it's free. Somebody said, how do you know if your API is in the cloud? You'll only be able to know if your API is in the cloud if you are looking at your API in this way, where I can see there it is sitting on the cloud and I can actually access it via the cloud. That's the only way in which you'll be able to do that. Right, so let's now return to our slides. Okay, so that's the API management component. Okay, so what I want to talk to you about today is security. So security is something that when we are developers, we must make sure that we secure our APIs. It doesn't help if you've got this amazing application going and people hack into it and, nobody wants to use it after that. And what we see here is that between 2021 and 2030, they are expecting almost like 1,000% increase in attacks on these things, because this is where, this is the edge of a company, the APIs. And you can look here and you can see, just look at this exponential growth in API attacks that have been happening. So for us, it's very important that you just understand something about the security that we should enable in our APIs. Okay, so here are just examples from 2021. Now if you look at these things, you can hardly believe it that people do this. But in 2021, there was, for example, the Polar API attack. And all that it essentially is that there was no authentication on this one API. So anybody could hack into the API because it's just open, and they can then access the backend and they can then see what they can get there. A second one is, it was the Clubhouse leak. Again, no authentication, nothing of any kind there. And basically 1.3 million people's data was stolen from a SQL Server database. So, this is what's happening in the real world. And then even LinkedIn, one would not expect something like that from LinkedIn. But LinkedIn also had a public API that did not have nothing, no tokens, no passwords. And so some malicious actor was able to scrape about 700 million people's data out of LinkedIn because of this API that was there without any authentication. And then there was another one. It's an Android emulator where you actually have to download updates from the server. And what they managed to do is they actually access the backend. So they installed malware. So when you do a download, you actually are downloading the malware. And so essentially what they needed to have done here is server-side authentication. If you have server-side authentication enabled, then this type of thing will not happen. And these are just examples of many, many types of problems that we see today in the world. And, the basic, the very first thing that we should be able to do is authentication. And then we take it from there. Okay. So what we want to do is, here is, for example, your customer endpoint. And so what we want to do is we want to, whenever somebody should do either a get or a post or a put or a delete, whenever they want to access that controller, we want to make sure that they do have to provide credentials and that you can check those credentials against a username and password in a database, and only then you allow access to that endpoint. Okay, so what we are going to be doing is we are going to be using JWT authentication. That is a token-based authentication, and we are going to apply authorization to our endpoints. Right, for web API authentication, we have a number of different schemes. Now, I'm not going to discuss all of them, and I'm not going to discuss them in a lot of detail. And there's many ways of securing APIs, so I'm just sort of touching on the most important components. But basically, first of all, HTTP authentication schemes, you, for example, can enable basic authentication that lies sort of in your environment. And that is just the basic authentication that happens between, like we do when we actually access our SQL server, on our local machine, and you don't really you authenticate using Windows credentials. Something like that can also be done, but then we pass basically our credentials also via the HTTP channel, and those credentials will be passed up and down. And a very important point to make then is that when we're passing credentials in HTTP headers, you have to make sure that you are sending encrypted information. That's the one thing. And secondly, you never want to send the password. So what you always do is you hash the password or you do something to protect it. So while the password is in transit, the password is protected, it is encrypted, but also it's not the actual password that is sent, but it's rather just the hash of the password that is sent across because you want to make sure that that is not exposed. So that's the one way of doing it. What we can also do is we can set up API keys. That is for the developer. So when you access as a developer the API, you have to have registered with the company, have received an API key, and then you can send it through. And then we have two standards that are very important that we use out there in the world. All of you have gone, for example, on some website, and then you have to authenticate using, let's say, your Facebook account or your Gmail account or Google account and so on. And this is essentially where we are using things like OAuth and OpenID Connect. And these are all token-based. So we are going to implement a simple form of token-based authentication in our project, just as an illustration of how these tokens basically work. And then in the whole framework that we have in ASP.NET Core, we have something called middleware. And so middleware is like, if you want to call it, it's like a long pipe. And in this pipe, there are these points where different things are done to the message and how the message is essentially intercepted. And then it's taken through this whole pipe. And you can set as a developer, you can, for example, say, well, I want nothing done. So you don't enable your middleware at all. Or you can say, no, but I want to have certain things done like authentication, and then you enable it in your code. But you can decide what you want to actually enable. So you can see that if I look at my middleware, I have a request that comes in, and the request wants to go down there to the endpoint. But in this whole process, this channel that happens in HTTP, I can actually start and I can say, well, first of all, I want to look at exceptions. Then I want to look at a very secure, I want to make sure that HSTS means, is your browser secure? I want to look at redirection, static files, routing, calls, looking at how calls are made to me. And then down here, we are looking, for our purposes, we are looking at authentication, authorization, then anything else you want to build in, you can build in. And finally, we get to our endpoint. So there's a whole framework available for us as developers to actually go and set up various configurations and code that will do lots of checks on the message before it actually, only now it gets to the endpoint, something happens and then it actually has to pass back through this whole thing and the response is sent back to that side. So there's a lot of sophistication in the framework that we can make use of, but for now we are mainly going to handle here our authentication and our authorization in that point there. Okay, so for our purposes, what are we going to be doing? So for our purposes, one of the things you must always remember, you never build security from scratch. Security is something that you try, you always follow best practice, you use other people's algorithms that they have shown works and that are very secure. You use the tools that are available, you use the patterns, you make sure that you don't do your own thing, because that's the sure way of getting hacked. Is if you go and decide, I'm going to do my own thing, I'm going to use my own protocol, or whatever it is you think you can do, don't do that, because you are going to run into issues, you don't understand the issues. So for our purposes, we want to essentially do authentication. So what do we need for authentication? We need to handle usernames and passwords. So there is something called ASP Core Identity, which is essentially a whole framework that has been provided to store the identity and to manage identity information in this, because we are going to be storing our SQL Server credentials. We are going to be making use of Entity Framework. And yeah, so we are actually, I'm going to show you how we are going to actually use this framework and scaffold, and we are going to migrate tables into our database using this whole framework. And it's a very good way to understand how this works. So basically, in this namespace, what we see is we have all these different models here. So the models is where we define what our structures look like. We have things around roles, claims. Then we have here is the user we are going to be using. We have user roles, we have tokens. So anything around identity that you want to store is available for you to use this in a very sort of, it's a very proper way of doing this. Okay, for us to be able to do this, what we are going to be defining is we are going to be defining something like this. We are going to be using this inside our application. And what we are then going to be doing is now, remember in our previous discussion, what we did is we called it the database first approach. So what do? You create a controller, you take your database tables, let's say for the customer, you scaffold from the customer table a controller that now will be able to update the controller. So in other words, what you've done there in scaffolding is you've actually gone and you've taken data and you've created classes, you've created models to actually be updating your information. But what we now are going to doing is we are going to reverse this. So what we are going to be doing is the code first approach. So we are going to say, well, let me go and create classes, or in my models for my, I want to actually be updating identity, usernames and passwords. So I'm going to migrate them, and I'm going to migrate them and create database tables. So essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this framework as the models, which is something given to me. I'm not going to be writing all of this. And I'm going to say use the domain classes, do a migration, and go and create in my database the actual tables that are required for the purpose of authentication. So we are going to do the full thing, but you'll see we are going to be creating a lot more tables than what we really are going to be using. It's just so that you understand how it works. Okay? And so essentially, this is what we are going to be ending up with. So, this whole namespace here essentially is describing here what we see here. So I have a users table. You can see it's got a lot of information. So username, email, it's got all this information that's sitting here. I've got tokens, I've got logins, I've got roles, there's a lot of information. And this is what, if I now take the namespace and I migrate information, you'll see this is what you'll end up in your table. You'll end up with all these tables that are sitting here that are now available for you to be able to use and to actually create usernames and passwords. But it all looks quite complicated from this point, but when you see what we really do, it is not such a major thing. Okay, so essentially for our purposes, what are we doing? We are doing token-based security. So token-based security is saying that, I want a ticket. So let's say, for example, you want to go to a concert. So what you may do is you go on the internet, you log in, you buy a ticket. And when you go to the concert, you print the ticket, you take it with you. And when you get there, you just show your ticket. You don't have to, again, tell them, this is my name, and you don't have to go through that process. All that you now show is here's my ticket. And that's essentially what we will be doing in token-based security. So you will be authenticating at one point using certain methods. And then when you've authenticated against the database and all your credentials are in order, you will be given a ticket. Now, this is your JWT ticket. So essentially, I will say, right, I'm the client. I'm going to make a call to the server. I'm going to go to the authenticate controller, and I'm going to give you my username and password. And you are going to check it. And what are you going to do? You're going to give me a ticket. So you're going to return the ticket to me. And now I have the ticket. Now this ticket, if you think about going to a concert, the ticket will have an expiry date. When the concert's over, your ticket is meaningless. And the same applies here. We can decide, I want to put on my ticket an expiry date. So let's say it will live for 2 hours. So I'm going to, this token is not going to live forever. It's going to live for an hour or two or so. So I can decide on that. And this is very important. If you're a software developer, for example, is now to check when people present tickets, is this ticket still valid? Because the validation should be according to the time that it should be still alive, if you want to call it that. So now I've been authenticated, I have a ticket. What's the next step? Secondly, I now want to access a resource. I want to access some method or controller. So I'm going to say, I want to get my users. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add this ticket in a certain way to the header of the HTTP request. We call it a bearer token. Bearer means here's something I want to give you. And there's a specific way of adding this in Swagger on our code. And so then I'm going to send the ticket to you. You are going to then validate the ticket, the expiry date, the signature. You're going to check everything's fine. And then if the ticket was valid, you then can give me the result. And this ticket I can be using, I'm showing one method here, but this ticket I can be using up and down for various methods for which it has been enabled. Right, so this is essentially what we will be implementing with token-based security. Okay, so our API endpoints will basically look like that. We are going to create, okay, here I just have the weather forecast. This is your sort of controller you want to access. But before you can access it, you first of all have to register, and then you have to log in. And if you, for example, are admin, you can also register as an admin. So these are the types of endpoints that we will be looking at and that we will be creating. Okay. Bearer authentication, that is how we use JWT tokens with. It's basically an HTTP authentication scheme where you're going to take your ticket, you're going to add it into the HTTP header, and if you have the ticket, you can get access. It's basically some string that we generate, the server will generate, and you can read up more about it in here. And this is what a token looks like. So basically a token looks like this. Here we see a JSON token. Okay, so this is what it looks like. It's encoded here. And what it mainly consists out of, it consists out of 3 parts. First of all, it consists out of a header, which says, well, this is the algorithm that I'm using, doing hashing with. It's a type JWT. That's the first thing. What is inside the ticket? You can see it's not readable, but what's inside it is that this is my name and whatever information I want to put in there. And the last part is very important. So here I see what is my signatures that I'm going to add. So basically, when somebody receives this ticket, how do they know that it is a valid ticket? So I'm going to send you a ticket. Now, what do you do with a ticket to make sure, like if I go to a concert, what would they do? They would look at the ticket, let's say at the barcode, and they will look at me and they will look at the name on it, or whatever it is. They will check the ticket. So when you present a ticket, first of all, before you can continue into the venue, it is checked to make sure it's you and you actually are allowed here. And the same thing happens on our server. When our server receives a ticket, now remember the server actually sends the ticket to you and you're sending it back. So basically what it will do, it will take the header and the payload, okay, and it will do a recalculation and it will make sure that, yes, nothing has changed. So you want to, for example, make sure that, this has been hashed, there is integrity on the payload, and you want to make sure that nothing has changed on this ticket, and you can recalculate it and you can say, yes, I can trust this ticket. So each and every time, and this is also, again, something the framework must do. So if you don't check tickets, again, you are going to expose yourself to hackers on the outside. Right. So that is essentially all from my side in terms of that. Okay, so let's just go to, so that's basically the background of what we want to do. Okay. Right. So I'm not gonna, let's just see if there's any specific. Okay, so you have been answering. Okay. Right, people, so let's have a look now at the code on how to actually go and create. So what I've done is I've already, let me first demonstrate it to you just to show you before we start. So let me just show you how it works, then you'll understand what we are doing slightly better. So what we see here is we have an API, it's running, I'm just running here on my local machine. And so what I need to do is, first of all, I need to register somebody. So I'm going to register somebody. And so this is now a user. Now, what's happening when I do the registration is I'm going to actually be saving this information on the databases I mentioned to you that were migrated into my, database I'm using. Okay, so let's, for example, say I have somebody called Lisa. And remember that when you are doing your password, the password is following the basic conventions that you must use at least 8 characters, and it must be a variety of things. So I'm going to make a password like that. Something like that. Let me just put one more in just in case. Okay, so that is my password. So what I'm going to do is, and that's something you should also do, is just keep track of your passwords that you don't, struggle later to remember what you were doing. Okay, so there we have I'm creating a user. I'm going to run this. Okay, and you can see there it says that, yes, I've created a user, created successfully. So now I know that this user is somebody that is registered, okay? And so now I can log in. So now when I log in, I'm now going to, this is now where my username and password will be verified against the database. And then I will be able to get the ticket. So that's the main thing. When I log in, I'm not logging in now to actually go and access a resource. I'm logging in. It's a separate, you can see logging in is a separate controller. So the reason why I'm doing this is I just want to get, so my username is that. My password I just created. Okay, so now I'm going to say execute. And so basically what happens now is it's going to check against the database my username and password. And so what it comes back with, it comes back with my response. And what do we see inside the response? Inside the response, we see, oh, here's a token. So what I now do is this is what will happen in the background. This token will now be received by the client. Your client machine will receive it. And so when you now start sending requests to the server, you are then going to take this token and you are going to send it along. Now we are simulating this thing over Swagger. So we need to go and copy this. So I'm going to make a copy of this token. And I now have a token that I can use to actually go and access my, my controllers. So what we also now see, we have enabled through the code bearer authentication, and we see this lock here, that's sitting here showing us this. So now I need to actually add the token to this call before I do it. So basically all you do is you click on that and you then see, okay, it comes up and it says I have bearer authentication enabled. So I'm going to copy it. I'm just pasting my token in here. I'm going to say authorize. So what it's now done is actually just added into the header of my request. It's actually now added the token. I'm going to say execute. And you'll see that now it will actually go and show me the information that so this is just the simple weather forecast application, but I've been actually authenticated to actually now go and access that. So that's essentially what we are trying to implement. So you are implementing separately from your controller's authentication, and you are running this then through Swagger with tokens. So I'm not going to, let me just stop this. I'm just going to run you through, I'm going to give you a document, a guidance document with more detail on actually, what it is that we need to show. And so the first thing I just want to go to is the database. Okay, so basically I'm doing this little application. Right, this is actually my, but this is essentially what I'm looking at here. I have my database for this is the little database we initially used for our first little exercise, is the products database. So the products database is linked to this project. And essentially what we need to do is we are going to enable all these different, so if I, for example, look at the user here, you can see that the user I just created now is sitting on this little database. So whenever you access something on the database, you are going to be storing it in these files that are actually tables that have been created, and the process I'll show you now. So everything is sitting here in this database. Okay, so the first thing that we do is in our project, you will open a normal project, and you're now going to have to create a new folder. And let's first of all look at the dependencies. So the dependencies I will give you also in your guidance document, but this is essentially what we need to add into our dependencies here, your packages. You can see I have the JWT bearer, I've got identity like I mentioned, identity entity framework to be able to do this migration, and then I've got my normal core ones, and that one is for Swagger. So you have to add those packages into your application. The next step is now to create authentication. And this is then basically, you could call it the models that we are going to be creating, that we are going to be using. So let's just look at, for example, the simple one is the user one, the application user. So here I've just called it the application user. And you can then see I'm just using the application user for authentication using identity user. And so this is then essentially a model that will take the structure provided by Microsoft, and it will then create a table for me in that way. So if I look at the table here that we were looking at, let's just look at this table. You can see it's got username, it's got all the information we looked at just now. So I'm not, going to put this in my code. It will automatically do that for me. And I've got, login. So login is going to make use of username and password, register. You can see register, response. So I've got a few things there. This is my login model then. Okay, then I've got my application DB context. So this is then the session that sits between my models that I've created here and my database, and it's going to manage the up and down and all the interaction between those two parts. And so we create you'll just have to go and create. And so what I'm going to give you is I'm giving you the code of each of these classes. So you must go open a project, add the dependencies, and then you are going to create each of these classes one by one, and then you'll have everything you need to be able to do this. So that's the first thing that we do, okay? Then what we are going to be doing is now you've got that ready, and now you want to migrate your, do your migration from this into your database. And there's a straightforward command that you just do. It's just do the migration. And what it does then, it creates this migration folder. And this migration folder, let's just see what is in it, okay? So this is now code. When you run a migration, this folder will be created, and what will sit inside your code? This is essentially what you'll see. So what do we see here? Now, remember what it does. It takes the identity framework that is provided to the namespace, and it's going to now take that, and it's going to actually now, create all this code for me. It's creating a lot of code so that it can create the databases for me. So I'm going to essentially, out of this solution, I'm going to run the script, and it will go and it will actually update the database with those tables I want. You can see here, it says, okay, here's ASP.NET user, and you can see all the fields that will be put into that table. And you can see there is the roles claim, and there's a lot of structure that sits here, and you can see this is the migration builder. So it's going to do all this for you. Okay, so it's a lot of code that's generated, and then you can look here and you can see there's some more here, looking at some other options. So basically what you do is you then do first option is just doing a migration. And then what we do after that is then we are going to update our tables. And when we do the update of the tables, the second command, all these tables are going to be created for you inside your database. So now you've got that ready. You have your and then the next step will be your controller. So now we are going to write our authentication controller. The weather forecast one is already there. What we now have to do is we have to do the authentication controller. And so I'm going to provide this code for you. And so basically what I'm doing here is I'm creating those 3 controllers that I showed you just now that we are working with. Okay, so I'm going to then provide this for you so you can use it. So I have a controller here, authenticate controller. And essentially what this thing is going to do, it will implement, you can see the login, which is a post. When you log in, how it will check the credentials for you. You can see there it's actually going to, and what we see here is when you've logged in, it's actually going to now create a token for you. And you can see I'm setting here the actual validity of the token to add 3 hours. So in other words, when I look at the token will be valid for 3 hours from when this has been done. And you can then obviously go and change these things. Yeah, let me also quickly, in the app settings, you can see in the app settings, what do we have to do is we have to first of all put in our connection string. But then what we also do is we have to then put here our information, and especially this one here, that is sort of your secret that you are using, and key is something that is optional that one can also use. But this is then the secret that is defined, that is going to be used to actually create the token with. So you have to, in app settings, set up the information so that you can use your JWT token. Okay, so basically here we have all the, I'm looking at the wrong one. Here we have all the options, and here we see how this is how we register. So that is then the code to register admin. And admin, you can say if somebody is a normal user and admin, you can also add that sort of thing in if you want to then do your code. Okay, so that what we now have is, so we have our database ready for that purpose, and now we have our controllers ready. And so now what we have to do is we actually have to now take our weather forecast controller, and we have to now something I have to now say is that this should not really, I'm still struggling with something small. This should not really be there. And I'm trying to, I think it's something to do with the way in which I'm using my middleware. But yeah, I think I need to sort that out. But yeah, wait, I just have to look at the programs. I still look at that. But yeah, here in the program class, what we basically have to add also is, after you add the controllers, this is the order in which things should be done. So after this point, we say, okay, I have to enable my application DB context. In other words, there's my connection string I've set up in my app settings. So I'm using that context there. For identity, I have to now set up the following. I'm going to be using identity role, application user, what I've set up before. I'm going to now say, right, for authentication, I'm going to be looking at my bearer, and here I'm going to set up my bearer token. So I have to do that. I'm going to be adding authorization. And then, yeah, you can also see I'm going to add in the way in which I'm going to be using Swagger with my bearer token. That's where I set that up. And here you set up the name if you want to change the name that you display. And yeah, here is the description. This is then what we see when you're adding in the token on the page. You can also then say whatever you would like to have there. But this is where the bearer token is then added. And then we are going to be using OpenEye. And then over here, We then specify, okay, I'm going to use authentication and use authorization. Yeah, so then basically here in your program, you specify all the different aspects that are required, and the order in which they happen is also quite important. So when we return here, what we essentially must do is just use authorize to enable authorization. So if that is gone, if you, for example, if you don't have that there, it will just ignore totally the actual checking of usernames and passwords. It will just run like normal. But yeah, it actually only, to be honest with you, it only should have that one there. So for my purposes, yes, I'm still struggling with something small to get that right in terms of the middleware. But essentially, this is what you'll see. You'll see authorize. And then this means, right, this specific controller has been protected. If you don't have it there, it is not protected. So every single controller that you want to protect, you can then add in here. If you, for example, are going to use the role option, I'll put that in the document. In the authorize, you just have a property to say, well, I want to also add in that somebody has to be of a certain role, and you can also add that in there. Okay, but for my purposes, I'm actually going to, it's just to get this thing, right, let me just see, not that there. Yeah, so I still have to sort that out. It's just something small that I'm still struggling with, but basically, that is how that works. For some reason, if I don't have that there, but I think there's an issue. But essentially, this is how this program will work. So you have to set up all those options I've given you. And yeah, I'm going to give you then this document that will give you all the guidance and all the code on how to do this. And so that will then be this implementation of security. So let me just see if there are any questions on here. Okay, so do I need to add an extra table to authenticate, to do authentication aspects? Now, all the data tables that is provided, I think is very sufficient. You don't have to do additional things. Will there be a class in recess for sprint 5? Now, in recess, I think we've planned around it. There's not going to be a class then. Sprint. Yeah, when is sprint 5? So yeah, now I don't think we've planned around that. We won't have classes in recess. So in recess, you should have time to spend on other things. Right, so from my side, I think that is everything. So are there any other questions? So basically what you have to now do is make sure that you can host on Azure. I think that is one of the most important things for you to do. Get your application on Azure, and then from there on, you can start adding stuff. So like when you're going to be adding in security, obviously what I always do is I would first go locally. So first of all, get your controllers up and running for the normal thing. Get the normal methods that you're supposed to be implementing, get them working on your local machine. It's always easier to sort it out then. And then when that's ready, you can then deploy to Azure. You can always be deploying to Azure all the time. Obviously you can also be doing that, but just to sort out small things in code, rather do it locally. Then when you've done that, then you can go and say, well, let me now add security into my project. And you can then essentially take what I've shown you here and you can add security into the project. Right, so that's all from me. Okay, then there's a priority in the project briefs. Yes, so you can have a look. Obviously, if something's priority 1, it's much more important than priority 5. After updating the Kanban project access with a date, no. What do you mean by a late submission? No, I mean, if you just update the project's access, it shouldn't affect any dates as far as I can see. Right, so that is then all from my side. Is there anything else? Jackie, Ms. Miller, would you like to say anything? Anything you would like to add? Okay, I don't know. I think she's probably not right here now. She's just on her machine. Right, everybody. So if there's nothing else from anybody else, I think I've covered everything I wanted to say. So all that I can say is I hope that you enjoy Project 2. It is really a very nice project to do and to complete and to have all those skills and understand what's going on in the background. And try out, you know, the API management service on Azure. It is something that's quite interesting to have a look at, and it does help you to debug some of your issues. You should be running into issues. You can go there and test out your code there and see that it does work there. Right, so if there's nothing from your side, then I'm going to close off now, end of the recording, stop recording. Right, and so